The next stage is being able to astral project after concentration. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about and looking at practices that relate to astral projection. But this is a really important quote to remember, because in the end it's not until we learn to come out of the physical body and work in the astral that we actually start really progressing in the path. And just the simple act of astrally projecting, and doing it once is enough to really change the way you look at the rest of the world. When you really have a genuine astral experience, then you just basically verify yourself that, you know, there's more to the human being than a simple body of flesh and bone. There's more to the universe than the physical dimensions you see before you. There are two important skills that must be developed to progress in the great work. So just a summary of what I said. The first skill is concentration, and the second skill is astral projection. Those are the two skills we have to learn to develop. Concentration was the focus of phase A. Now in phase B, we're going to shift to astral projection. If we're talking about astral projection, let's back up for a second and just have a look at what is the astral plane, because the process of astrally projecting is to place ourselves in the astral plane, so we should examine the question, what is the astral plane? Simply put, the astral plane is another dimension. You can call it a parallel world, you can call it another dimension, you can call it a higher dimension, you can call it a paradisiacal region, you can call it a heaven. It doesn't matter, it's all really describing the same thing. The astral is one of two planes in the fifth dimension. The fifth dimension has two parts to it. The first is the astral part, the other is the mental plane. Okay, so sitting in that chair in front of you right now, you've got length, width, and height. And of course, as you sit there examining length, width, and height, the fourth dimension of time flows through. When you step up another level, you get into the fifth dimension. The fifth dimension has two parts, the astral and the mental. The astral plane is associated with your emotions and the emotional center. The mental plane, as the name suggests, is associated with the thoughts in the intellectual center. If you want to work in the mental plane, just think of something. Just imagine something. Imagine you building something, or imagine how you got here. When you go off into your mind and work with your thoughts, that's where you're working. You're working in the mental plane. The problem with our emotions and our thoughts is, remember when we speak of the bodies, we have the lunar astral body. We also possess the lunar mental body. Okay, and the lunar bodies are basically used by the ego. That's why it's so hard to control our emotions and control our thoughts. Okay, and that's why we have a hard time consciously getting to the astral plane, or even higher than that, the mental plane. You can think of the fifth dimension as having two levels. The lower one is the astral, and the astral transitions into the mental. Was that a good time? Okay, the astral is one of two planes in the fifth dimension. The other is the mental. So the lower half of the fifth dimension is the astral. The higher half is the mental. Astral associated with emotions in the emotional center. Mental plane associated with the thoughts in the intellectual center. The astral is a higher dimension, and consequently it's governed by less laws. When we look at the different dimensions, we kind of always expect them to be the same thing as the physical, but that's not the case. The higher we go dimensionally, we encounter different laws. Actually, we encounter less laws. The higher we go dimensionally, the less laws that there actually are. For example, when we go to the astral, we discover that there's things like there's no time there, because if you've gone to the fifth dimension, you've gone outside of time, which is a really unusual concept. To us right now, we perceive time as something that's linear, right? The future comes before us, and the past goes behind us. But really, time isn't linear. It's like it's a closed loop. Okay, that's the symbol of the serpent biting its tail, right? The Ouroboros. Kind of use this analogy, right? We know the Earth is round, right? But if you stand outside, what do you see? You don't see round, you see perfectly straight. Okay? If you step back higher and get out of the orbit of the Earth, you then can see that the Earth is round. Something quite similar happens with time. To our perspective here, we see time as a straight line. But if you step far enough out of time, dimensionally, that straight line is actually a part of a much larger circle. There's also no gravity, because gravity is a product. It's a law that's related to this physical world. It's not something we find when we go up dimensionally. The astral plane contains the fifth dimensional aspects of objects and things that exist in the three-dimensional plane. That chair right there is also multidimensional, just like you are. The only difference right now is the senses that you have, be it touch, be it sight, be it sound, be it taste, if you wanted to lick the chair or whatever. Those senses are just tuned into the three dimensions. So that's all you see is the three-dimensional embodiment of that chair. But that chair also exists in the astral. It also has a fifth dimensional component. Okay, just like that chair will change over time, showing it has a fourth dimensional component, objects and things exist in the astral as well. That's why, Native Americans, one of the things they would always talk about when speaking of the white man, when they first encountered us, would say things like, well, you guys, you can see the tree, but you can't really see the tree. What they were saying is your sight is very limited. You can only see the three-dimensional aspects of that tree. You can't see the elemental entities behind that tree in the fifth dimension and beyond, because we just don't have our senses tuned to that. It's the same analogy as a radio station. A radio station hears whatever frequency it's tuned into. There are other frequencies in the air around it, but it only picks up the frequency the receiver's tuned to. Okay? Learning to astrally project is kind of like tuning that radio station to a different channel. It is taking our senses and shifting them to a different set of frequencies, allowing us to perceive what's happening outside of the three dimensions. So in the astral plane, we can see the astral matter of this room. Doors, windows, all that kind of stuff. If you astrally projected into this room, it would look a lot like this room. There's some differences in the way that matter presents itself. Upon close analysis, the wall wouldn't be quite the same. Objects take on a different type of characteristic. They almost seem to vibrate or pulsate with energy a lot more than they physically do here. But that's an important aspect to remember. And we talked about this briefly before, the idea that the astral plane must be some crazy, wild, wacky place that's so completely different from the physical. That's not the case. It can be as you ascend higher, and then when we start talking about the mental plane and beyond, things start becoming quite different as form breaks down and everything is composed more of light really than anything else. But when we start talking about the lower astral, this room looks a lot like this room. He's not doing its thing. The fifth dimension, interestingly enough, is where the egos reside and manipulate us through our five centers. Okay, so when we look at the fifth dimension, that's where we find the egos. That's their world. Okay, so they're the puppet master sitting in the fifth dimension. The five centers are the strings which make the physical body dance to the tune of the puppet master. Yeah, that was the analogy I was looking for, yeah. Okay, so the fifth dimension is where the egos reside. And as we mentioned earlier, we have the lunar bodies for the fifth dimension. We have the lunar astral and the lunar mental, which are basically the coats, the cloaks the egos wear. One of the goals on this path, if you remember, is to work with alchemy, to transmute the energies and to build the solar bodies. The solar bodies being the vehicles of the consciousness, not the vehicles of the ego, bringing ourselves to a different level consciously in the astral dimension and in the mental dimension. Many beings and intelligences, including the recently deceased, reside in the astral. That's one of the surprises that people get when they get to the astral, is they're not alone. There's people up there. There's all kinds of people doing things. For example, every time you go to sleep, you go to the astral. So yes, you can see people who are sleeping. You could find a friend who's asleep. They probably don't recognize that they're asleep. They might not even recognize you. Okay, you can interact with them, but it's almost like they're sleepwalking. If you've ever known somebody sleepwalks, they wander around the house, they're oblivious to what they're doing. You can sometimes carry on conversations with them, but their attention really is directed on something that you can't see. That's like what happens if you find a friend or a family member or somebody in the astral. People that have passed on, you can find them in the astral as well. It's a similar experiences to somebody being asleep, except you probably won't be able to wake them up and make them realize that they've passed on. It's one of those, it's a kind of a semi-disturbing thing to do, because they'll basically be living in the astral as if they were living in the physical. Okay, remember the key thing about the astral is thoughts create. Everything a subconscious mind projects, the astral conforms to that. So people that are recently deceased are wandering around in the astral doing everything they did in everyday life. Just curious sometimes why people won't talk to them, or they think that everyone's mad at them, or they've done something wrong. They don't really realize where they are. How else was that to go that? So you can find people that are sleeping. If there's somebody else that you know is astrally projecting, you could actually talk to them. Okay, so for example, if we, and this is some of the practices we'll sometimes do as a group when we start getting into second chamber, is we'll have practices where we all try to project to the same location. The idea being, if you could project into this room and I could project into this room, we could see each other, interact with each other, and then when we came back to our physical bodies, we could remember what we were doing. But that's the problem. You don't know whether somebody you see in the astral, and this is the catch, is it really them or is it just your ego projecting? Okay? Because if you go to sleep tonight and you have a dream about me, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've found me. That could just be an aspect of your subconscious that you've projected. Okay? And that's the catch, and it can be quite difficult to try to determine whether you're dealing with an element of your own subconscious or whether you're dealing with an actual personification of that person, or whether it's just them in a sleepwalk state. Just for me, it was a recent thing of about 3 weeks ago. I found myself astrally projecting. At the time I realized I was in the astral, I was with a friend from work. And when I was actually practicing the discernment technique, and something jumped out as unusual, and I realized once again that I'm in the astral, not in the physical, and I was with my friend. And usually at that point, when I have that eureka moment of I'm in the astral, usually the dream fades away, and I'm able to perceive more of the reality of the astral. At this point, this friend was still with me, which made me think, okay, if he's still here, this must be not my egoic subconscious projection of him, where he's personifying some ego or something inside me. He's still here, so this must be him as he is actually projecting. We must have bumped into each other. And I spent, I don't know how long, trying to convince this guy that he wasn't in the physical anymore. And he kept saying, well, you know, prove it to me, and I'm doing all these crazy things and all this wacky stuff is happening. And he's kind of furrowing his brow, but he's not quite able to see that. And we were talking about devising a test, as funny as this sounds. He said, okay, if this is true, if you're if we're astral projecting, there's got to be some sort of a test that you know you can do to me that's going to prove to me that I was here last night. And at that point, we walked into it's funny to talk about, but we walked into a room, and there was a bunch of people in this room, and there was one individual who was, this is a silly story, who was wearing this really funny-looking puffy yellow sweater. And my friend sees this and immediately starts laughing at the sweater. And I said, okay, that's the test tomorrow. Tomorrow when I see you at work, I'm going to ask you what was the sweater. And he said, okay, and if I remember puffy yellow sweater, then this is going to prove to me this whole astral projection thing is true. Well, anyways, the next day comes at work, and I catch him in the kitchen, and I'm like, I'm going to ask you a question. You got to say the first thing that comes to your mind. You can't pause, you can't hesitate. I'm like, what color was the sweater? He's like, what? I said, what color was the sweater? He's like, what the hell are you talking about? So I wasn't able to actually rouse him to realize that he was in the astral. So that's some of the difficulties when you encounter something in the astral. The first difficulty is it a projection of your own ego? The second thing is, just because you see somebody doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to remember the conversation. Sometimes if you're visiting friends and family members, they may remember a dream. Like that's what I asked, pressuring my friend, like, do you remember this dream? Do you remember us going to the waterfalls? Do you remember seeing this yellow sweater? And all he could say was, I don't remember much of my dreams, but I think you were in it. So that's the most you're going to get, is influencing somebody that they might remember you of some part of their dream. But it's very rare that you'd actually be able to wake somebody up completely, unless they are, of course, conscious as well. It is a whole other world and existence for us to discover. And don't forget that when you're in the astral, you're existing outside of time. So in one night of streaming, or in this hour or so that we'll actually be in the state that allows us to be in the astral, you can accomplish all sorts of things. And we've all experienced that. That's the whole, you know, falling asleep between the snooze button. My snooze button is, I think, 9 minutes on my alarm. And, you know, between those 9 minutes, I can have dreams that seem to go on all for hours, because you're outside of that dimension of time. To walk around in the astral plane, we need an astral body. The astral body is the vehicle that we use in the astral dimension. Remember, each body is just, you know, the vehicle that we use to interact in that dimension. Just like we need a car for the water, we need a 4x4 for off-road, we need a boat, or a car for the road, a 4x4 for off-road, a boat for the water, a plane in the air. There's different vehicles to interact with the different dimensions. It's the same thing. We have an astral body to interact with the astral dimension, a mental body to interact with the mental dimension. It's important to remember, and this is the key, that we have a body of sorts already for the astral, but it's not the proper body. It's the inferior vehicle that's just something that's used by the ego. If the legitimate solar astral body is a majestic ocean liner that can cruise the ocean, the lunar body is a canoe with a bunch of holes in it. Okay, it's the inferior version. We kind of use it to get around, but it's really hard to be conscious in the astral, just like it would be really hard to cross a large body of water with a broken down canoe with holes in it. Okay, the canoe would constantly be sinking, which would represent us losing our consciousness to the ego. Okay, so we do have vehicles, but they're not the proper vehicles. That's why it's difficult for us to astrally project. If we develop the solar astral body, astral projecting is as simple as focusing on that dimension and going there. And if you ever, there's stuff all over YouTube with all kinds of things of Master Samael speaking, oftentimes his students would ask him a question, he'd pause for a second and say, okay, well, I have to go to the astral to find the answer, now I'm back and here's the answer to your question. Which is kind of a strange thing. But that's what we're able to do when we have the proper bodies. For us, we've got to put our body in the right state and relax the mind and spend all this time in concentration and focus just for us to awaken concentration for a short period of time. One of the challenges, of course, in going to the astral as well is staying conscious there because the ego is so strong. Even if you have a lucid dream where you're suddenly aware that you're dreaming, quite often, after a small time frame of lucidity, you fall back into the dream state. Same thing too when you're consciously astral projecting. You can get there consciously and you can start interacting, but then something distracts you and then you find yourself slipping back into the dream as the ego takes over. Okay, providing we have the ego there, it's going to be really hard for us to stay conscious. The ego in the end is always going to take our attention. Okay, just be like the idea of having those television screens on the wall, and all I gotta do is run down the hallway. I'm conscious, I'm here, I just have to get to the door. Ooh, something good going on over here. And that's it, you've lost that consciousness, and the ego takes over, and it just turns into a simple dream where you wake up and realize that you fell asleep while you were meditating or whatever. We have to develop the solar astral body to work and exist consciously in the astral. If we are unconscious in the astral now, when we pass on, we will be unconscious in the astral. It'll just be like a dream. But if we can work to develop consciousness in the astral here and now, when we decease, we will continue that consciousness in the astral. Okay, giving us a type of, you can call it an immortality. Our consciousness would exist on in the astral dimension. Okay, and that's one of the reasons to awake consciousness, so we're not caught on this wheel of samsara, just grinding around from physical body to physical body to physical body. Astral projection occurs when our consciousness unfolds into our astral vehicle and we have experiences in the astral dimension. Okay, the consciousness is like the driver of the vehicle. So you've got the garage that has the car in it, the 4x4, the boat, and the airplane. Okay, the consciousness represents the driver. Okay, when we fall asleep at night, as an example, that's like parking the car in the garage and taking the airplane out for a spin. Our consciousness unfolds into the astral vehicle, and then we start wandering around there. The experiences that we have in the astral, they're either conscious experiences or they're just the simple projections of the subconscious mind, the projections of the ego. Okay, once again, it's just a reminder. Astral projection sounds like some weird, crazy, esoteric thing, but every human being does it every night. How much of it you remember depends on your own abilities and the way that your dream memory works. But we've talked about that before, expanding our memory by working with a dream diary and that kind of stuff. It's important to remember, as esoteric as astral projection sounds, it really is a normal part of human existence. It's not as crazy as it sounds in the idea of multi-dimensions and all that kind of stuff. This is something we've been accustomed to our entire lives. Okay, the only difference is when you go there at night, your consciousness is still trapped asleep in the ego. So all those projections manifest before you as dreams, and that's why those dreams are disjointed and irregular and weird. That's just all the ego surfacing in the astral projection, the astral world conforming to those thoughts. Imagine if you had a television screen on top of your head that could always show an image of what you're thinking. If you looked at that television screen, it would actually look like most of your dreams. Okay, all kinds of weird scenes and characters changing and discontinuity and all that kind of stuff. It's relaxing. It's water. It's there's two ways to astrally project. Okay, be asleep and awaken consciousness during your dream. That's lucid dreaming, and we looked at that process during the dream yoga class. And the second way to astrally project is the willed or conscious projection with meditation techniques. Okay? Either way, it doesn't matter. They both do the same thing. They both put you in the astral with your consciousness awoke. And really, as far as your body, your physical body is basically asleep for both states. If you hooked yourself up, and they've done this, hooked people up to machines and measured their, EEG, the electroencephalogram, and the EKG, electrocardiogram, like what's happening with your body, and they can see basically it's the same state. It's the same state as being asleep. okay, as regards heart rate, blood pressure, and that kind of stuff. And even your brainwave activity takes on the theta state when we're consciously astral projection or in deep meditation, which it does many times during the night as well. So as far as the physical body is concerned, it's sleeping, which of course is important to remind us of the importance of relaxation for meditation. Okay, relaxation and concentration. It doesn't matter what you're doing, you're getting to the same place. This is usually a good place to start, and most people who have the first astral experiences, it's usually like this. Okay, and the more you start to meditate, the more you notice your lucid dreaming increasing, because those things are connected. Okay, as your consciousness starts to awaken, it is usually able to awaken easier during dreams. Okay, and then you usually have this happen before you have this happen. And oftentimes while you're practicing this, you usually get that too. Okay, and that's usually the way it is for most people, and I can say that that was definitely the way it was for me. It took me a while to get to this point, but while trying to get to this point, this was happening more and more regularly. So by the time I got there, I was able to recognize it. It was basically the same state. But it doesn't matter. The end result is the same thing. You're in that other dimension, and you're conscious that you're there, and the problem still exists of trying to retain consciousness and not having it slip back into that dream state as the ego tries to take the reins again. Awakened masters can project consciously at will. Okay, so an awakened master could sit in a chair and project. And it's kind of a funny thing that Master Samael I'll use the term tease his students with. He says astral projection is as simple as drinking a glass of water. Okay, once we learn to put our mind and body in a proper state, astral projection is quite easy. The challenge is getting to that point that allows it to happen. Okay, we have to learn to utilize that door of sleep. We don't consciously project. Why can't I right now just sit down and consciously project? Why can't I do it as easy to master? Just as a reminder again, we don't have the proper bodies. That's why it's such a challenge for us. When we build the proper bodies, it becomes easier. So yes, if we're working with alchemy, astral projection becomes a lot easier as well as we're developing those energies that are required. Once we have awakened consciousness, then we simply project at will like the masters. It's not a big thing involving meditation and all this kind of stuff. You can simply switch senses between the dimensions at will. Once we develop our solar astral bodies, I mentioned earlier, that gives us that level of immortality in the astral world. So if we decease or something happens to the physical body, we're still able to keep operating from the level of the astral. As we have ego and our consciousness is asleep, we can't astral project at will. That's why we have to use all these various techniques and practices. Okay? Because we have that sleeping consciousness, we have to use these various practices to develop the ability. We have to put ourselves in particular states to allow the projection process to occur naturally, to allow that unfoldment to occur naturally. Okay? Because remember, every time we go to sleep, every time the physical body is in the right state of relaxation, the consciousness automatically unfolds into the new body, into the astral body. Remember, there's a transition state that exists between awake and sleep. Okay, and that's something you can actually measure, and that's the theta state, the theta brainwave state. It's also known as the hypnagogic state, and that's that weird state where I call it the napping in the couch on the afternoon state, or the snooze button state, where you're basically half in the astral, half in the physical. Your brain is doing something really interesting. Another curious oddity as well, when you study the brain activity of small children, during their waking state, they have a lot of theta wave brain activity. But as we get older, we get less and less and less of that until it only exists for a very small time between the awake state and the sleep state. Okay? And that's the state of brainwave activity, and they can stimulate it in people and do all kinds of things. And there's a lot of people that study that particular state because that's where things like astral projection and all these other weird properties seem to exist. There's something our brain is doing which allows us to unlock all these latent abilities. If we pay attention and if we concentrate, we can voluntarily and consciously come out in our astral body in that transition state. Okay, so that transition state, the napping in the couch state, the snooze button state, not quite asleep state, not quite awake state, that's the door to the astral. Okay, and if we can work with that point, if we can pay attention and concentrate at that particular point in time, we can use that doorway to slip out into the astral. Okay, so that's the important clue, and that was the big one to really understand, is we have to take advantage of that special state that exists between vigil or the wake state and sleep state. Okay, so this is a strange, it sounds like a strange thing, but we need to study our sleep. Study what happens to you in the process of sleep so you can learn to identify this state. Okay, for me, might be different for everybody. For me, it's a point in time where something really weird happens to almost like my thoughts. It's almost like my thoughts take off on their own and start talking amongst themselves. It's almost like I lose control of what I'm thinking and suddenly I start thinking random, bizarre, incoherent things. That to me is the clue that I'm getting to that point. Okay, and then that's accompanied with physical things that we'll look at, if not today, I think that might be next class, we'll look at some of the physical sensations that are associated with that state. Okay, and as funny as that sounds, study your sleep. Study what happens when you're really tired and you're not falling asleep on the couch, or what's happening between the snooze button. Try to pay attention to what is happening physically and what's happening mentally so you can learn to identify that state, because that state is the door. We have to let the physical body fall asleep so the unfolding of our body will occur naturally and without effort. That's the weird thing. Astral projection, we don't actually have to put ourselves in the astral. Okay? That happens automatically. What takes effort is preparing the right state of mind and relaxation of the body to allow that automatic process to occur. It happens automatically every night. Every night we go to the astral. So we don't actually have to put ourselves in the astral. That process of unfoldment from the physical vehicle to the astral vehicle, that happens automatically. We just have to set up the conditions of the situations that allow that to happen. The conditions of and the situations being the right state of relaxation of body and mind to allow that to actually happen. Okay? Meditation must be combined with that sleepy state, must be combined with that drowsy state, which is why we spend so much time talking about properly preparing ourselves, relaxing the body and relaxing the mind. Because when the body slips into that sleep state, the body basically says, okay, I'm asleep now, I need to heal, so it literally kicks the consciousness out into the astral body while it repairs itself. Okay, so we don't actually put ourselves in the astral. That's the strange little irony of the whole thing. We don't actually put ourselves in the astral. That happens automatically. We have to set up the right state of mind and state of body that allows that to occur. Yeah?
I've actually heard that waking up to an alarm actually is bad for your dream memory. Is that true? Like, you mentioned the snooze button being like the in-between state. That's almost the opposite of what I've heard. So
I don't know about that. I don't know, because in my experience, the more abruptly you're woken up, the more vivid and more details you seem to recall from your dream.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm not really sure, but in my experience, I would say that's a no, at least for me anyways. Willed or conscious astral projection occurs when the mind is concentrated at the exact moment that sleep occurs. Okay? What normally happens, and I described it with myself, I'm falling asleep and becoming more and more relaxed. Eventually my thoughts take off and become really bizarre and random. That's the ego, like in full-on manifestation. Okay? And it's almost weird. I don't know if you've ever sensed this yourself, but they actually start talking to each other. You ever experienced that? Your thoughts almost start talking to themselves? I'm like, what the hell is going on? That's the egos. As you're sliding from one state to another, you imagine you're passing through a group of egos at that point, and you're actually hearing them talking to each other. It's really bizarre. If normally those egos are present doing that stuff, that's what happens when we sleep every night, and that's why we transition into the astral, but basically with our consciousness still trapped in those egos. Now imagine that same state, but instead of those thoughts becoming random and haphazard, it's a focused point of concentration. It's a single thought, it's a mantra, or a visualization, or whatever meditation we're doing. When our physical body falls asleep, if our mind is concentrated and focused, we transition into the astral and keep that consciousness, keep that concentration. We don't slip into the dream state. We enter into the astral consciously. Okay? And that's the difference. That's why with meditation, that's why concentration is so important. If you're not concentrating, if you do by haphazard chance happen to relax the physical body to the point it falls asleep, you just simply asleep, which is what happens every night. You're going to go home, fall asleep tonight, lay in bed, you're going to let your mind wander, become random, haphazard, you're going to transition into the astral, but you're not going to notice because those wandering thoughts are just going to become the reality that you perceive there, and that's what you're going to remember as your dreams the next morning. That's why it's not unusual if we have something stressing us or bothering us, or even something we're looking forward to. Whatever's on our mind, it's not unusual to dream about that stuff. Okay? If we take whatever's on our mind and make it a concentration, make it a mantra, make it a visualization or something like that, then that's what becomes what we experience in the astral. We go there consciously. Now, there's some physical sensations associated with astral projection as well. And this is kind of neat because probably there's some of these you're going to go, I've totally felt that before. I know exactly what he's talking about. These, you don't have to have all of these happen to you. Different people seem to describe different things associated with astral projection. There's a list here I'm going to show you. I've had some of them, but not all of them. But I've talked to other people that have had ones that I haven't had, and vice versa. The process of unfolding of the astral body is associated with many different sensations. Okay, there's some physical things that are associated with astral projection. One of the interesting ones is feeling suddenly lighter or heavier. Okay, now some people will describe this as the body suddenly feeling very light, almost as if gravity was taken away and they suddenly feel like they're floating. Other people will describe it a bit differently. Other people will suddenly feel like a huge weight's been dropped on them. They just feel really heavy. Usually when you're sliding into the astral body and you notice it, that's what you perceive as light. If you were in the astral and you're slipping back into the physical, that's usually what you perceive as heavy. Okay, because sometimes we waver back and forth between the astral and the physical before finally going out. Okay, so it's not unusual to sometimes feel heavier. I've never had this one, but I used to have that one all the time. Okay, especially when I was younger. I used to have this sensation of being like crushed in the bed, like a huge weight was like forcing me down into the bed, and it was almost like, it used to scare me when it was happening because I didn't know what it was. Imagine every point of your body, imagine all these hands just forcing you into the bed. That's what it used to feel like, this sensation of tremendous weight being applied to you. Feeling the heartbeat intensify, we'll look at some practices that actually use that. Okay, what I mean by intensify is not faster, 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 but the heartbeat becomes louder and louder and louder to the point that you feel like it's going to basically shatter your body. Okay, it's not that your heart starts beating faster or harder, so it's not bad for you or anything. It's just your perception of the energy associated with your heartbeat. Okay, and that lends itself to its own meditation exercise that we'll look at as well. Feeling of not being able to move or paralysis. Okay, that's another one that happens as well. And this one used to happen to me all the time too, and this used to scare the hell out of me because oftentimes these two would happen together. Okay, and there's written documentation of descriptions and codexes going back thousands of years of this experience. Okay, and that gave rise to the idea of, you might have even heard this before, what was it called, the old hag? The kind of old wives' tale of like a demon or something bad coming after you. Yeah, sitting on your chest. And ancient woodcuts show a little scary demon thing sitting on people's chests because they used to scare the hell out of people. They had no idea what was going on. All of a sudden, you know, something doesn't feel right, so you got to move and realize you can't. Why can't you move? Because you're not in the physical body. You're trying to use your physical limbs, but you're not there. Okay, so that, of course, your brain reacts with the fear, which of course the ego really loves, and that usually makes you slightly, you know, suddenly wake up in your bed with your heart beating and, you know, you're sweating and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so the feeling of not being able to move or paralysis. An electric sensation passing through the body. I've heard it described, because I haven't experienced this one personally, I've heard it described as like a bolt of electricity going from the feet to the head or from the head to the feet. People have the different versions, but like an electric current or some kind of energy just rushes through your body, and that lets you know that you're no longer in the physical body, you've transitioned into the astral. Feel like you are rising or lifting. Okay, this is a one that often people describe as well. You're laying in bed and all of a sudden it feels like everything just suddenly floats up. Or you're sitting in a chair and it feels like everything floats up. It doesn't have to be your whole body. Usually it's like a part of your body. Usually like you're lying down and suddenly it feels like your torso is literally peeling out of your body, and there's almost this like little panic that you're kind of stuck because you can't go back and you can't go in. Orientation shifts. This is something that happens to me. What I mean by orientation shifts is I'm laying in my bed and suddenly it feels like somebody came along and just suddenly flipped my bed upside down. If you can imagine somebody came along and flipped your bed upside down on you, that weird sensation of I feel upside down now, that happens. Okay, yeah, spinning or rotating or turning on some particular axis. For me, it's always forward head first, but I've heard it described as well as going backwards or even going sideways. Okay, so you're laying in bed and suddenly it feels like your bed is spinning around and around. That's a sensation associated with your transition from the physical into the astral. Fingers, arms, or legs rising or lifting, so it doesn't have to be your whole body floating. It can sometimes just be, you feel like, and this is one that I've had as well, it just feels like your arms suddenly do this, even though you know you're lying in bed or sitting on a chair. Okay? An intensifying buzzing sound coming from within your mind. Something that's referred to as the anahat sound, and we're going to study that a bit further in detail today. This is a common thing as well, audio phenomenon associated with astral projection. And it's unusually common, and it was funny because last week, no, this was Monday at work where my office is, it's just across from where the student cafeteria is, and there's this group of students sitting around talking. They don't really know anything about astral projection, but they're all describing the sound. You ever had one of those like dreams or whatever, you're lying in your bed and you get this like really loud buzzing, and it gets like really loud, and all these students are discussing it, and I walked by and I said, it's the anahat sound, go look it up. And gave me this strange look, and maybe one of them Googled it, and we'll find a whole bunch of interesting information, because audio phenomenon is really common. For me, it sounded not so much as a buzzing, but almost like a tearing. You can imagine a sheet of paper that's being torn, but it's a really long sheet of paper, and it gets louder and louder and louder, this really buzzing, ripping, shredding kind of tearing sound. That's associated with the sensation of astral projection. The orientation shifts, I should have mentioned as well, you don't have to physically be in motion. Sometimes you can be lying down and you suddenly elect with the perception that you're sitting up or that you're standing up. The first time this ever happened to me, the orientation shift concept, I was lying down in bed and I knew the position that I had, and suddenly it felt like I was the other way around. Suddenly it felt like I was looking down, and I felt myself bumping up against something from behind me, and when I opened my eyes, I realized I was bumping up against the ceiling, looking down at myself in bed. Okay, so that's what I mean by orientation shift. Sometimes it's a spinning thing, but you can be lying down and feel like you're standing up. Or you know you're sitting in the chair and suddenly it feels like you're standing up before the chair. That's because your astral body has done its thing and changed its position, and you've got the memory of where your physical body is, and now you have the memory or the reality of where your astral body is, and you're able to compare those two, and wait a second, something doesn't feel right. Okay, so that can be an orientation shift. So now we'll have a look at the anahat sound, which is you can think of it as the audio phenomenon that's associated with astral projection, and it's interesting enough and common enough that it deserves a little bit of focus of its own. Master Samael describes it as the subtle voice which is constantly reverberating in our mind. The idea being that it's always there, you just can't hear it because of all the chatter of the ego. It's a high-pitched whistling sound, or a sharp hissing sound, also known as the song of the cricket, the hissing of the serpent, and in the Hindu culture they called it the voice of Brahma. Okay, so it kind of sounds a little bit different to everybody. To me, I describe it kind of like a cricket, sort of like electric kind of tearing noise, for lack of a better term. I've heard some people describe it as a boat motor. One of the guys that I know that experiences on a regular it's a regular occurrence for him. He describes it as a boat motor, like a little kind of boat motor when you're out on the lake with a little motorboat, and he sounds like he calls it the boat motor. The boat, will be lying there, and the boat motor will get louder and louder and louder and louder. That's how he perceives the anahat sound. To hear this sound, we must clear our minds of thought and keep it in a state of calm and silence. Okay, and to perceive the sharp hissing sound, the hissing of the serpent, the voice of Brahma, or the song of the cricket. Now, the ancient Romans, they used to keep crickets in cages in their bed to help them with the process of astral projection. And there's an Aztec codex, there's an Aztec carving that's called the Hill of the Cricket. It's like a stone carving. We all know that I'm a really bad artist, right?
Yes.
Okay, so this won't surprise you. What this codex kind of looks like is there's a hill, and at the top of the hill is a cricket. What's a cricket look like? It's got big legs like that, right?
Just like that.
Just like that?
Perfect.
Okay, it's got big legs and some little ones here. And he's got a head. He's smiling. Both got an antenna and an eye. Do they have wings?
Yeah.
Okay, well,
That's how they make the noise. They rub their wings together.
okay, well there's his, there. That's a cricket. So this codex has this cricket sitting on top of this hill, and then there's all these people. And these people, their heads are on strings. And their heads are kind of floating around. So there's another person down there. That one's got a shoulder injury. And there's another head over here. and you had this picture of all these people lying around at the bottom of this hill with their heads floating. At the top of this hill was the cricket, and this hill was named Cricket Hill, and this is where they'd go to learn to astrally project, because the sound of the crickets emanates the anahat sound, and it's able to, through sympathetic vibration, help us tune in to that particular sound in our brain, put our focus on it to help it become louder and louder. We even have a meditation CD that we use here, which is crickets. Somebody went out in the backyard somewhere, there was no noise, and the sound of summer, right? The 6 million crickets all merging together into that one sound. That's the anahat sound. And even as a kid, one of the experiences I'd love to do in the summer was I would fall asleep with my window open to the sound of the crickets, right? Because that would bring about all these really interesting experiences. Okay, so you didn't actually videotape my thing, did you? Oh, that means people would see that.
I'll cut it out, don't worry.
Or you could, do an artist rendition. You can do some
Photoshop.
videos for me. Photoshop it.
I
There
do,
we go.
I'm
You can Photoshop a cricket there and stuff. All right, that'd be awesome. Okay, but in order to hear that sound, we have to be able to clear our mind of thought, because it's one of those properties that we don't even notice because of all the ego, all the chatter that's always in there. When our mind is in deep silence, we will be able to perceive the sound. That's why when we're concentrating and doing our practice, sometimes you hear that sound and it becomes louder and louder and louder. Louder and louder to the point that it's almost scary. And it really wants to make you open your eyes to figure out what's going on. The first time that I had that sound happen to me, I actually bolted up in bed and ran and flipped the light on, and the lady that I was with at the time who was in the bed was like, "Oh, what's the problem?" I'm like, "Did you hear it? What happened? Did you hear it?" She's like, "Did you hear? Why didn't you hear anything?" I'm like, "How could you not? It was so loud." I'm looking out the window to see what's going on in the street, trying to figure out what it was. She was like, "Oh, you must be dreaming about something. You must be dreaming about something." And it wasn't until years later that I came across this and went, "That's that damn thing that keeps happening." I was wondering what the hell it was. Yeah. When we perceive the sound, we must let ourselves become absorbed by it. That's the whole process of the sound becoming louder and louder until it's almost like our entire body is resonating. As the friend I know who describes it as a boat motor, he says it sounds like the boat motor is about to come crashing through the bedroom wall. It gets louder and louder and louder. We want to let that process occur until then the doors of the mystery will become open to the student. The student should get up from their bed instinctively and go out of the room and head towards the temples of the White Lodge. The temples of the White Lodge are the points in the higher dimensions where the masters, the intelligences gather to, to teach people. Feel it that way. Those are the teaching places of the higher knowledge in the higher dimension. Okay, the doors of the mystery become open. That's the astral. The student should get up from their bed instinctively and go out of the room and head towards the temples of the White Lodge. What he means by get up from the bed instinctively, he means get up from your bed and walk there. Okay, because once that sound starts and once you get to the point where it's completely enveloped you, that's when you're in the astral. There's no point just lying there in bed, because if you're just lying there doing nothing, you're in the astral just lying there, and eventually you're going to fall back into a dream again. Okay, remembering that a lot of times, one of the theories I have, I've been able to quite prove it, is that many people who are learning to astral project are a lot more successful than they think they are. They're just in their room and they've projected, but they projected in a chair and they're just sitting in their chair. And eventually either they just return back to the physical body because something happens in the house, alarm goes off or whatever and pulls them back, or they just slip into a dream state and fall asleep. Okay, the important thing is you have to really get up and test where we are, and we'll look at that in a few minutes. Another thing to help you discern the anahat sound, if you don't have the crickets or something like that at your disposal, you can fall asleep vocalizing the mantra S like a soft, peaceful whistling sound. So yeah, just like that. This will help you make the anahat sound resound in your mind. It gives you something to focus to find that sound in your mind, because producing that S sound through sympathetic vibration will get that aspect going in our mind, and we can narrow in on it, and then at some point we're going to stop making the mantra S and let the sound in our mind take over, and then of course it becomes louder and louder until it reaches the point where we're able to use that to physically project. Another thing, we can fall asleep or meditate while listening to the sound of crickets. This sound mimics the anahat sound and will also make the anahat sound resound in our mind. So we can use the mantra S, or we can do the cricket thing. And like I said, we even have a CD here that's just an hour long of crickets. Listen to the crickets. When we are meditating or doing any practices, we must test to see if we have unfolded from our physical body by getting up and actually doing something. Okay? So if you're lying asleep in bed or napping on the couch or doing a practice and you perceive any of those physical sensations, or for whatever reason you just get the feeling that something's not right, you have to get up and test to see where you are. Remembering that those two worlds are so close to each other in appearance, we often don't know where we are. Okay, that's why we got to do things like the pulling finger and the discernment technique to figure out where we are. Remember the story I told you once of I was lying in bed, I'm really thirsty, should I get up and have a drink? No. Should I get up and have a drink? I can't be bothered. Should I get up and have a drink? You just can, we've all done that, right? Or maybe it's got to go, should I get up and go to the bathroom? Maybe I can hold it. What time is it? I can hold it 4 hours. Maybe I should go when I'm really tired. Well, this one day I was doing that, should I get a drink or not? And I finally decided I was going to get a drink, so I got up and walked downstairs, and it wasn't until I got down to the kitchen and went to grab the cupboard door that I thought something didn't look right about my hand. And that's when I realized, because I went, what the hell? And I realized that I was in the astral. Like still laying in bed, I'd crossed over into the astral, but the thought in my mind was get up and drink. So that was the activity that I did. And it wasn't until I was able to discern and realize that I'm not in my physical body anymore. That whole trip down the hallway and the stairs, no idea. It wasn't until I saw my hand that I thought, wait, something just didn't look right with my hand. And for me to stop and go, oh, discernment technique, I wonder where I am. Yeah, this is my kitchen, no problem. Let's see what happens. Whoa. And that's when I realized that, no longer in the physical, something had changed. Okay? It's important to test where we are. When we're falling asleep or doing a meditation, whatever, and we find ourselves in the transition state that, am I awake, am I asleep, I don't really know what's going on, we should rise from our bed without hesitation, without reasoning, without thinking, without doubt. Just get up reflexively and automatically. Don't stop to think. If you were going to get up to get a drink in the middle of the night, you would sit up and swing your legs over the bed and stand up, right? Okay? We're not talking about visualizing or pretending or imagining. I mean get up. I don't mean in your mind's eye and visualize and practice. I mean physically stand up. Okay? Physically get up and stop to see where you are. Okay? Because as I mentioned earlier, one of my little theories is that a lot of times we are successful in projecting, especially when we're in bed with the snooze button thing, drifting in and out of consciousness. We just have to catch ourselves in the right state. Because if we're just laying there, eventually we're transitioning between waking conscious dream over and over again. If we can catch ourselves in that conscious moment, we can realize that we're in the astral. Okay, so if we have anything that's happened that's out of the ordinary, anything doesn't feel right or whatever, get up reflexively and automatically. Okay, one of the practices that Master Samael talked about, and I've heard this one described in other books, if you have the time to do this, you could give it a shot, is set your alarm to go off like every hour on a night, or every half hour or something. Every time the alarm goes off, hit the snooze button, wait a few minutes, and then get up and stand and test to see where you are. You're just trying to catch yourself in the hypnagogic state. The downside of that practice is if it didn't work, that's one, that's not a good night's sleep. You're going to be pretty crabby the next morning, probably, being woken up every hour, standing up, pulling your finger, trying to go back to bed, trying that over and over again. But yeah, even to this day, I'll catch myself doing that in the morning, because everybody hits the snooze. I hit the snooze probably 2 or 3 times, and I'm getting to that weird state. I'll just randomly get up and see where I am. Most of the times I'm, still physically, but there's been instances where I've caught myself in between. But then the problem is I always get pulled back because the alarm really does go off the next time after, and that definitely wakes you back up, pulls you back in the physical body. Okay, so you always have to test. Like I said, I don't know what it is. I think we all expect that when we get to the astral, there's like a flashing neon sign or something's going to be so drastically different, or a disembodied voice that says, welcome to the astral. There's going to be something that makes it obvious, but the reality is there isn't anything that makes it obvious, because you go there every night. And is it obvious to you every night? No, it's not. You can have the most bizarre, strange, wacky dream, and at the time to you, it's perfectly normal, and there's nothing unusual about it. That's why we have to use all these little tricks to test to see where we are, to prove this to ourselves. Remember the story I've told you as well about the guy that hears a knock at the door, gets up to see who's there, discovers nobody there, starts walking back to his bedroom, freaks out when he gets to his bedroom because there's somebody sleeping in his bed. When he gets closer, he realizes it's him. The whole time he's been under this physical body. It's the same idea. Don't mentally get up, don't imagine, don't visualize. I'm talking about physically getting up. I'm talking about stand up and move. Okay? Because if you are in your astral body, you have to will it to move. You can sit there in a chair for as long as you want. You have to actually get up and start interacting. Do the little jump to see where you are, pull your finger to test discernment, look around to see if anything's out of the ordinary. Okay? Do a test to see where you are. We'll look at a couple basic techniques today, and then we'll look at some more techniques next week. the first technique we'll look at is one called projecting to a location. This one's kind of interesting. This technique involves visualization as the primary focus for concentration. Okay, so there's no mantras or anything else associated with it. It's all about visualization, which is some people really like this one. It's definitely an easy one to do. It's one that doesn't require making any noise, depending on your domestic situation. Not a lot of people can sit in a chair for hours mantralizing without people thinking they're strange. So this one is an interesting one because it involves visualization. I find visualization ones, for whatever reason, for me personally, they make it easier to concentrate than, say, a simple mantra. The more actively, because I tend to be an intellectual, which, remember, is not saying that I'm smart, it just means that of the three brains, that's the one that I overuse all the time. As an intellectual type person, the more intellectually engaged I can keep my mind, the more it seems to be easier to control. So visualization works pretty good for me. When learning this technique, begin by choosing a room in your house you want to try to project to. At first, keep it something close. Okay. Later on, you can use advanced versions of this technique to project to Egypt or something like that. But try by picking a room in your house. Okay. If you're in your bedroom, try projecting to your kitchen or your living room, or if you have a little meditation space, try to project from your bedroom to your meditation space or whatever. You're ideally just going to pick some location in your house you want to project to. Then you're going to go to that room. This is why you're still awake. This is in preparation for the practice. Go to the room and take some time to look around and examine the area in great detail. Let's say I'm going to project to this room here today. What I want to do is really study this room. Because normally you come in, you sit down, you don't really look around the room. So I mean, go to the environment and study the environment in as much detail as you can. Try to take a snapshot with your mind of everything in the room. Imagine you're going to walk out of the room and I'm going to tell you, okay, draw me a sketch of exactly what the room looked like. You're trying to study every detail, the shelf, how many books are on the shelf, the arrangement of stuff on the shelf, which pictures are where, the doors, everything. Just look around the room in great detail. Take a few minutes to walk around the room and just study everything. The ceiling, the lights, what is the format, what kind of carpet is it, all that kind of stuff. You want to examine the area in great detail, okay? As if when you were done and walked out, you had to write everything down or draw a picture or a sketch of absolutely everything in the room. Okay? Try to commit as much detail to memory as possible. And not only remember physical things, but try to remember like textures too. What did the carpet feel like? What do the walls feel like? All that kind of stuff. Okay? Study as much detail as you can and you're able to remember. Okay? And the great thing about it being a room of your house is, in a strange environment, that's hard because you've got a lot of detail to remember. But a room in your house that you're used to, you're going to be able to recall probably 75% of that right off the top. It's just studying it, you're going to pull out that extra 25% that makes the difference. Then what you're going to do is, after you're done studying the room in detail, you're going to go to your practice area and prepare your body for meditation. Okay, so wherever that is, go to your practice area and then do the complete breath and clear your mind and focus on relaxing the body. And then what you're going to do is, using your powers of visualization and concentration, reconstruct the room in your mind. Okay, build the room as you can. Now, don't see it as a two-dimensional thing. Put yourself in the room. Okay, so imagine you're standing in the room and you're able to look around. If you can, reach out and touch things in the room. Try to reach out and pick an object up. Something that kind of has a certain texture, something that's unusual. Maybe it's got a lot of weight to it, or it's like a fluffy thing or a rough thing, whatever. Try to pick something up and imagine what it feels like. You want to reconstruct as much of that room as you can. Okay, trying to recall every detail. Put all your mental image. And this is why I said this really works for me, being the intellectual that has a hard time controlling their mind. This really keeps my mind busy. My mind loves doing stuff like this, building, constructing something. Sure, no problem, I'll do that. But the whole time your mind is doing this, you're focused on that location. Now, as you're focused on that location and building that room, if the body is physically relaxed, at some point the physical body will fall asleep, and guess what happens? Because you're now in the astral and you've got your concentration firmly focused on a particular physical location, you find yourself going there. Okay, so see yourself in the room looking at all the objects, walls, touch things, interact with as much stuff as you can. You can even do things like put a particular scent, a particular perfume or a scented candle or an incense, and even try to bring back the memory of that smell as well. You want to actively engage as much as your mind as possible in reconstructing that environment. Okay? Concentrate. This is always the key, right? You're going to concentrate as much as you can, devoting 100% of all your mental processes to recreating the details of that room, trying to remember as much of it as you can. Involve as many senses as possible. Like I mentioned, try to put a scent or a perfume or a candle or incense or something in there. Reach out and touch things. You can keep a soft, fluffy thing in the room or a sharp, jaggedy thing, something for you to imagine picking up and feel the weight of it, feel the texture of it. If you concentrate enough and remain focused and relaxed, you'll actually project into the room. Okay, the next thing you know, that vision of the room will transition into the reality of the room before you. Almost like you got it in your mind's eye, actually going from your mind's eye into the physical space before you. The first time I had this technique work for me, it wasn't actually a room. It was my family had this cottage up north, and there was a couple nights I was working with that. I was imagining myself inside the cottage and walking the same route. I would walk out. I would walk out of the bedroom, into the kitchen, out onto the porch, down the stairs, across the lawn, out onto the deck, across the water. And just do that route over and over again in my mind every night as I was falling asleep. And after a couple days of doing that, one night I remember really firmly concentrating on the image of me standing in this dock of the sun and the water. And the next thing I know, I'm standing there. It was a strange kind of, wait a sec, something's not right, wasn't I? And then I realized that I'm standing here, like I am standing here. What happened? I was thinking about it, and now I'm actually here. I was able to actually transition to that particular location. Advanced versions of this exercise include you can go to anywhere you want, basically. Pyramids of Egypt, Stonehenge, whatever. One of the interesting things, like the Pyramids of Egypt, the Sphinx is a good example of this, as is Stonehenge. In the physical right now, you can think of these locations as markers for something much greater in the higher dimension. So right now Stonehenge is a bunch of rocks. Right now the Sphinx is just an old statue. But if you go there in the fourth dimension, you'll see that there's something very special in those locations. These are centers of all kinds of activity and learning and stuff like that. It's almost these are left behind as signposts to go to those particular locations. So advanced versions of being able to use visualization as a projection exercise is we can take ourselves. And there's one we'll look at later on. There's a practice we use here with a specific mantra to go to the Pyramids of Egypt to try to reach that location. You can project to the other planets as well. I have projected to Mars. That sounds really wacky, doesn't it? It's a place just like this. It's not red, it's not anything weird, it's just another location of another kind of place. I was kind of surprised to see that. I expected, I don't know what I expected, Martians or something. It's people, and they're there. And, the three-dimensional aspect, no, there's nothing there because it's uninhabitable. But the fourth-dimensional aspect, there's people on that planet, and you can project yourself there, and you can head to that location. But it's just a place. I was kind of disappointed, as funny as that sounds.
So when you project to Mars, is part of the projection the actual movement physically from Earth to Mars, or is it just
it's almost an instantaneous thing. It's not like you see yourself departing and you're going towards the red ball. It's almost an instantaneous thing. Okay. Remember when you take time out, everything. It's kind of weird. We think of distance and time being related, but when you take time out, everything is in the same place simultaneously. Let's imagine we're looking at that. Let's imagine we're looking at a map. Okay, we look at where we are in London and North America, and let's say we want to go to Egypt. Now, for us right now to go to Egypt, we have to go to the airport, get on a plane, fly over the ocean. There's a distance and the time involved with that. But if you're looking at a map, if I'm looking at London, England, or London, Canada, and I want to be in Egypt, what do? I just shift my gaze and I'm there instantly. It's kind of the same thing. It's not you're shifting your gaze visually, you're shifting your mental gaze. So it's easy to go from point A to point B on a map just by moving your eyes instantaneously by shifting your perspective or your focus. In the astral, you're able to, it's a similar phenomenon. Wherever you direct your attention to, you're able to go there. And it's almost like almost an instantaneous thing. There's no, you can fly around and that kind of stuff, but almost seems like the greater the distance, the more quicker you can get from point A to point B. Yes?
Is there a way to discern the difference between actually projecting to a place or just just imagining the place, not actually going there, but you understand what I'm saying? It's hard to explain.
Yeah, how do I know if I'm actually projecting there or if I'm just dreaming about the place?
Yeah.
You got to do those tests, right? That's the thing. It's if you're able to do this practice, like right from a conscious waking state to transitioning there, you can tell. You can tell. The question is if you're dreaming, you're in a location, then it's a little bit different. But yeah, you can tell because you're building this image in your mind, and that slowly, what's the term, morphs or transforms into what you see before you. It's almost like a before and after that you can kind of tell. But and same thing, just because you project there doesn't mean you stay conscious. You can then find yourself slip back into a dream. Actually, what I described there when I projected to that cottage, that to me has a lot of associations of, egoic things, fun and partying and drinking and all that kind of stuff. So when I realized that I was in that particular location, I started walking around, and then the emotional context of being in that location again. Next thing I know, there's my whole family's all there, and back into a dream. And the next morning I wake up and I remember the conscious bit, and then I remember the dream that it slipped into, which is some of the challenges of projecting. People are sometimes afraid, what if I can't get back? Or, what if I get trapped? You never worry about that. You worry about, why can't I stay longer? How come I can't keep it? How come I keep slipping back? How come I keep losing it? It's always the other way around. You're never worried about getting trapped. You're always, why can't I stay there longer? Why can't I stay there longer? Advanced versions include working with a group to all project and meet at a location together. That's something that you could strive toward if you wanted to do, and that's something that we will occasionally work with in the second chamber. Some of the higher levels is try to all project to a location. The idea being those that were successful would be able to see each other, that sort of thing. So the practice we're going to do today is we're going to project to the location. There's a room that we're going to go in. We'll take our usual 5-minute break. We've got lots of time for this practice today, which is a good one. So we've got lots of time to put ourselves in the proper mind state. And then there's a room you've never been in before, right behind that door. And we're going to go in there and we're going to walk around and study in as much detail as possible. Then we're going to come back here and, as always, prepare the body and the mind. So we're going to take the time to properly relax the body, properly relax the mind. Obviously work with the element of prayer. Don't forget that as part of all of this stuff, I never really keep saying this because it never really goes away. Prayer is always a part of all of this. If you think of a prayer as just willpower that's focused and directed, you can think of it that way. And then after we've done that, we're going to turn our mind on that location. I'll even put the crickets on as well, in case we want some help from our friends of the cricket.